Okay, hello friends, and welcome to an exciting Haggadah public shiur. Today we have the privilege of hearing from Rabbi Lieutenant Zarnighian, who will be exploring the personalities of the four sons of the Haggadah and what they teach us regarding educating our own children. Rabbi Zarnighian has been with us many times in the past, and I highly recommend all to check out his past shiurim, which is accessible on our website. To those who are here with us live, and for those who will be watching after, thank you. And Chacham, thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Baruchim Habayim to everybody. It's a real privilege to be able to speak about Pesach, especially when we have Shonin Hilchot HaPesach, Samuch LaPesach. We have a special institution to learn the halachot of Pesach during its proper time. Davar be'ito matov. So people often focus on what is a kezayit, how much masad do I have to eat? Does it have to be the size of one's hand? Does it have to be half the machine masad, the whole machine masad? We get so caught up in minutia, not that the details of these halachot are not significant and important, they certainly are, but we often overlook some of the most fundamental and most impactful elements of Pesach, I think, which are the moments, the time that we spend around our loved ones, our family members, together as a family. Pesach is one of two periods in the Jewish calendar where the primary mitzvah of the Chag is familial. And what I mean by that is, for those who remember during our Chanukah shiur last year, we discussed this, but it's worth repeating. You have mitzvot that are incumbent upon the individual. You have mitzvot that are incumbent upon the Sibur, the nation, the Jewish nation as a whole. And then you have mitzvot that are incumbent upon the household. Ner Chanukah is one of those. It's incumbent upon each Jewish household to light the candle or candles of the Chanukiah each night of Chanukah. And also Pesach, when we had the ability to offer the Korban HaPesach, was incumbent upon each household to offer in Yerushalayim. Now that we don't have that, we also have a second mitzvah, which is, I suppose, not really a household mitzvah, but more of a mitzvah upon the head of the household, and in some circumstances, each individual, as we'll see in a second. That mitzvah is the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. We have the mitzvah of Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is accomplished when we recite the Shema. That's why we have the portions of the Shema that we do that discuss Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that's a mitzvah every day. But Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the retelling of the Exodus narrative, only exists one time a year, one night a year, which is Leil HaSeder. So let's dive into the text over here. You can't claim there's a mitzvah if you can't pinpoint to the Torah where this mitzvah exists, right? So we have two sources. In Perek Yod of Shemot, we have in Parashat Bo, Ulma'an tisaper be'ozne vincha, all the events which are occurring during the period of the Exodus that will occur with the Exodus of the Jewish people are occurring for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons, the Torah tells us, Borei Olam, God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, it should be for you to be able to retell be'ozne vincha uven bincha, to your children, to your grandchildren. What are you retelling? Specifically, et asher italalti b'Mitzrayim ve'et adotah asher samti vam. That which I have leitolel is properly translated, or loosely translated, I should say, that which I abused, not meant maliciously, but in the sense of taking vengeance. Ve'et ototai, and to retell those wondrous symbols. That's in reference to the makot. The makot are referred to by Borei Olam as otot, which I have placed in their midst. All of these makot were firmly established in the land of Mitzrayim for all the Egyptians to bear witness to. V'daten ki ani Adonai. And through retelling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, you and your children and your grandchildren will all know that I am the master of the universe that was responsible for all these things. Now, what I want to focus on is something very specific. You also have this mitzvah repeated in Perek Yud Gimel of Shemot. Here you have the language of Haggadah. You have two instructive verbs that are used here, lesaper and lehagid. What's interesting is that the Targum Neofiti, by the way, for those who are not familiar, is a Targum from, according to most scholars, from Eretz Israel. It's what scholars refer to as Palestinian Targumim, part of the Aramaic elucidations of the Torah that were part of the schools of the land of Israel, as opposed to the Targum, the elucidation of Aramaic that we are all familiar with, Targum Onkelos, which was really ratified and put into its formal composition in Bavel, in Babylonia. That's why the Talmud Bavli, our Talmud, refers to it as Targum Didan. It refers to it as our Targum, the official Targum of the Jewish people. So this is, I guess you could say, non-binding. This Targum does not bear binding precedent in halakha, but it's informative, it's instructive. And our Chachamim often refer to it. So the Targum refers to this commandment as litnan. Biglal titnun. I am performing these miracles and the Exodus so that you should be, this is, by the way, from the same Aramaic root as leshanot, like Mishnah, to instruct not only in the sense of you're sitting your family, your household down and you're reading from the Haggadah. It should not just be a passive reading, like you're reading from a tape, like you're a tape recorder of sorts. The mitzvah is litnan, to sharply instruct and to really get across clearly and meaningfully the narrative and the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So this is a very important point, not only from the point of view of halakha, because a person is obligated to hear or to learn the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim in a manner in which he understands. You have a chiyuv to understand it. Be'ozneh vincha. You'll notice Neofiti says, B'mashma'im devinchon. It has to be mishtama. You have to be able to understand it. So most poskim, most authorities are of the opinion that if your household doesn't understand what is being recited during Leil HaSeder, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. This is unlike, for example, Megillah reading, where we just had Megillat Esther. If a person, let's say, doesn't understand its recitation in the Lashon HaKodesh, in biblical Hebrew, you still fulfill the mitzvah, although you probably should be reading it along with the translation of your choice if you don't understand Hebrew. But anyway, before we go to the sources from our Chachamim, the Midrashei Halacha, and from the Talmud, I want to just jump the gun and let's see how Harambam, Maimonides, restates this mitzvah. You'll notice Harambam is very, very particular in his language. Mitzvah lehodi ala banim. He doesn't say it's a mitzvah to read to your children or to sing to your children. All those things are nice, but it's a mitzvah lehodi alahem, to inform them, to properly inform them in the sense that they are yodeim. They know, they have full grasp of knowledge of the narrative that occurred, the stories and the events that had occurred during Yetziat Mitzrayim. You'll notice it says mitzvah lehodi ala banim, to one's children. So from here you learn the primary, as I said earlier, the primary obligation rests upon the head of household to inform his children and obviously those who are members of his household. Even if one's children are not inquisitive, or maybe they just didn't have the opportunity to raise the question, which they're supposed to, which is how Manishtana begins in our tradition. In most Sephardi communities, right? The children always begin. But let's say they don't, then you have a mitzvah to begin. Because the Torah tells us, as we read, V'higatta levincha, you still have a mitzvah nonetheless to recount and retell your children these episodes. Lefi da'ato shel haben aviv melamedo. Harambam here now is telling you, what does it mean lehagid? it's to inform the individual, in this case, one's family members and children, according to their level of intelligence and understanding. So Harambam will now clarify what he means by that. And what I have highlighted here, if you notice, there are a lot of highlights in the source sheet. That's deliberate. So Harambam, unlike our Haggadot that have the famous 4 sons, which is the focus of what we are learning, Harambam groups together 2 categories of children. Im haya katan o tipesh. If the child is a minor, we're going to see what we mean by a minor. You can understand this in the sense that he's legally a minor, below the age of 13 or 12, or he's mamash, a toddler. Or if he is a tipesh. Now, that is also not meant derogatorily, like it is in modern Hebrew. It doesn't mean somebody who's stupid. Tipesh, as we're going to see, is in reference to somebody who has a little bit of difficulty penetrating the depths of a narrative. A tipesh is one who has a block in his learning ability and is only able to understand what is said to him, what is taught to him rather, in a superficial manner. So if you are dealing with this category of children, Omerlo, the father has to say, Beni, my child, all of us were once like this. By the way, from here we learned that it was still common in Misraim, in Egypt, where Harambam was, to have servants of this kind, which is an interesting moral discussion that we can perhaps discuss at the end of this lecture. But the father would say, you were once like this maidservant. You were once like this servant in front of you who's serving us tonight. And it is on this night that we commemorate annually that Borei Olam, that God had redeemed us from this bondage, whereby we entered a stage of freedom, of liberty. More appropriately, as our Chachamim tell us time and time again, En ben chorin el misha asak b'Torah. So the cherut, the liberty that we had been granted during the period of Yetziat Mitzrayim, was not meant to let us loose like a bunch of loose cannons, but more appropriately, we are beneh chorin in the sense that we now are not subjects to Paro, not subjects to mortals, but we are subjects now to Borei Olam, to God Himself, and to His mitzvot. Now, let's say you're dealing with somebody, with a child he's an adult, or a chacham. There you have an obligation to actually go into detail regarding the events, the miracles, and the entire process from the Makkah of Dam to Makat Bechorot to Kriyat Hayam Suf. Again, a father knowing his child's ability and capabilities of understanding, and therefore to be careful to teach the child according to his ability. Now, the source for the passage that we read in the Haggadah is from the Midrash Halacha, known as the Mechilta. Mechilta was Midrash Halacha composed by the school of the Tana Rabbi Ishmael, and that version of the 4 children appears first in this text. You have not 2 categories of children like Harambam listed, but you have 4 categories. First, you have the Chacham. Famously, we read, what does he say? What are the details of the minutia, the statutes, the ordinances which the Lord our God had commanded us? That's the question. So Dad now has to address the Chacham based on the question that he posed. Af ata petach lo. Our Haggadot very often say af at petach lo. In Mishnaic Hebrew, you'll often find at is synonymous for ata. The Mechilta, at least in most versions, reads ata like in normal Hebrew. Anyway, so you have to then commence the discussion Behilchot HaPesach. The halachot of Pesach, obviously we're not talking about all of the simanim and Shulchan Aruch, but a father, according to the ability of his child, has to begin discussing the halachot of Pesach to him. And in particular, ein maftirin achar Pesach apikoman. We don't digress and indulge in dessert. That's what apikoman means, by the way, in Greek, right? It's the dessert that was consumed after a meal. So nowadays our dessert is matzah, but during the period of the offering of the Korban Pesach, when we were able to do that, the final meal, or excuse me, the final taste that was left in your mouth from the meal was not dessert. It was not matzah alone. It was the Korban Pesach. Okay. So we knocked out Chacham. What about the Rasha? I really want to focus primarily on the Rasha because he's, I think, the most misunderstood son among the four sons. So the Rasha, the Mechilta defines for you, Mahu Omer. What's the characteristic of the child that is defined as a Rasha? Ma ha'avodah azot lachem. You'll notice Chachamim, by the way, they very often in the Torah, when you'll see the word lachem, the Chachamim, by way of implication, understand that lachem comes to exclude the individual himself from the group. Lachem velo lo. That's what the Mechilta says over here. So the Rasha says this offering of the Korban Pesach, all these procedures, all the minutia that Pesach entails, ma'avodah azot lachem. What is this service, this worship that you were engaged in, that is for you? For you, but not for me. I don't care about this. I'm curious why the rest of the family is involved in it. This is a very bold statement that the Chachamim make, but it's very true, and it makes sense, as we'll see in a second. Because he excluded himself from the rest of the family unit, he's considered as abrogating and negating himself from one of the pillars, from one of the fundamentals of the Jewish nation, which is to be included. In response, I don't know why. I think a lot of people understand this as you also have to knock out his teeth. That's not what lehakhot means in Hebrew. I don't know how that understanding came to be. Shinav can mean one of two things. It can mean, according to some Hebrew grammarians, Mesudat David and others understand it as a form of dulling of the teeth. I don't think that makes a lot of sense in context. As we're going to see, it means you have to distance his rant. So if the Rasha is ranting about things that are anti our tradition and excluding people from our tradition, you have to distance his verbiage, his speech, ve'emorlo, and tell him, it is because of these misvot that we would be given. Zeh is in reference to the Korban Pesach, but it's also encompassing of the other misvot that we were given. Li, God did this for me, velo lecha, and obviously not for you, because you exclude yourself from the category of people that practice these mitzvot. Had you been there, my son, you would not have been redeemed, because you do not wish to include yourself among those who are given reason to be redeemed, to practice the mitzvot, and ultimately to do so, by the way, like the Torah tells us, to practice them in the land of Israel. Now, we're going to get back to the Rasha in a little bit. I just want to go on to focus on the remaining two children. Tam mahu omer. Tam is an ambiguous term. A little bit of a spoiler, but Tam is what Harambam refers to as a tipesh. Right? So the Tam, as we said, he's not stupid. He understands things at a basic level. Mazot, he simply doesn't understand the substance of the Pesach procedures, the Korban Pesach, the eating of the matzvah, of the matzah, the Arba Kosot, why we abstain from Chametz. He doesn't understand why. Perhaps many of us fall into this category, by the way. So, the father then has an obligation to say, this is interesting. You would expect the father to share the halachot with him if he doesn't understand what's going on. Notice the Mechilta doesn't do that. The Mechilta goes on to say that the father has a duty to inspire the child. You were not taken out shamefully. You should know, my son, you were taken out with might, with vigor, and that it was Borei Olam who was responsible for this. Once the child understands this, you can move on to other things. And I think that's self-explanatory, right? If a child doesn't know how to ask, you open up and you tell him, well, what you believe he's able to understand. That's what Harambam said when he said, even if you don't have your children asking, you have to tell them. Now, I'm going to just focus on a passage from the Talmud Yerushalmi, and then I'll take questions. And we won't read this inside, but the Talmud Yerushalmi has a slightly different take on things. You'll notice the first difference between the Yerushalmi and the Mechilta is that the Talmud Yerushalmi doesn't have tam, it has tipesh, like Harambam says. You have the Chacham, the Rasha, the tipesh, and the She'enu Yodea Lishol. The Chacham asks the same question as he did in the Mechilta, but the father doesn't teach him halachot. Instead, the father gives him the inspiration that the tam received, that the simpleton received in the Mechilta. The Rasha, I'll read this briefly inside the bold passage that I have in bold. He says, the Yerushalmi understands this to mean, what is this burdensome procedure? What is this burdensome holiday that you bring upon us every single year? The Hagim they're such a burden. They're such a Torah. You have to spend so much time, so much energy, so much money cleaning the house, getting rid of the Hametz, spending all this money, I guess maybe not back then, but nowadays on expensive Shemura Masa. It's such a burden. Why do you want to be involved in this? And it's because of that pessimism, because of that cynicism, that the Yerushalmi says he excludes himself from the people, and the father responds to him in the same way that the Mechilta tells us. Except the Yerushalmi adds, not that he wouldn't be redeemed if he were in Mitzrayim then. Instead, it says, Lo hayar ra'ui lehiga el misham le'olam. That's, I think, more of a precise way of putting it. This person with this mentality, this child with his current state of mind, would not be fit to be redeemed from Mitzrayim because of his mentality. Now the Tipesh, so you have the Chacham and the Tipesh, the roles are reversed. The Yerushalmi has for him Mazot, he asks Mazot, what are we doing? You have to teach him the halachot of Pesach, and when we had the Korban Pesach, as we said, you had to be invited to a particular chabura, a particular, I guess you could say, gang, right? That usually entailed family and family friends. And so if you were not, if somebody was not mazmin you, if they didn't reserve you for that particular group, you couldn't just jump from one group to another, and had to be consumed within the greater family circle. Ben she'ene yodea lishol. For that, the Yerushalmi has a little bit of a more precise language again. If there's no da'at in the ben, if the child doesn't have the intellectual capability, then aviv melamedo, the father has to teach him so he can begin somewhere. Okay, so we learn from here, I think, two things, and I'll take questions in a moment. Number one, we see that even our chachamim have different ways of dealing with children on different intellectual levels and who are of different, we'll say, traits of personality, different personas. there is no one-size-fits-all model of instruction, of teaching when it comes to the Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim in particular, but I believe that these principles apply also towards chinuch, towards educating our children and our students in general throughout the course of the year as well. The Chacham, you'll notice, do you teach him halachot or do you instill in him proper values first? That's not so clear. Same thing for the Tam. If a child is sincere and he means well, but he doesn't have any content to deal with, he means well and he has the capability to learn, but he's otherwise ignorant. Do you teach him halachot or do you give him the proper foundations to have a solid outlook on learning Torah, and then do you teach him Torah? That seems to be the core of disagreement over here between the Mechilta and the Yerushalmi. And then you also have this ambiguity with regard to the Rasha. It's not so much ambiguity, but it's more ambiguity in what he's complaining about. So I want to just very briefly, if anyone has any questions regarding what we have learned up until now, I'm happy to take them.
How did you translate Hakeh et Shinav the first time? You mentioned what it probably isn't, which is like blunting the teeth, but you didn't.
Okay, so that's going to be our next source right now.
Fine.
That's going to be our next source. So Sefer Yirmiyah primarily deals with the impending first galut of the Jewish people. Yeah. So over here you have Yirmiyah Navi says, "Bayamim ahem," once the Jewish people will be redeemed from this exile, lo yomeru od, you will no longer hear said, avot achlu voser v'shine vanim tikhena. This was a popular adage, a popular idiom that was used during the period of the first Bet Midrash. I don't think it was used during the period of the Beit Sheni or nowadays. I haven't heard Israelis use this nowadays, but it basically, so literally translated, it refers to the fathers, the parents eat unripe grapes, and the children have their teeth. This is where there's some debate among translators as to how to properly translate tikhana. Mesudat David, Radak, and others understand this to mean dulling of the teeth. Now, in context over here, it makes sense. What's the meaning of this idiom? The meaning is the mentality during the days of Yirmiyah Navi was Jews felt, many among Am Yisrael felt they could do whatever they wanted. V'shineh vanim tikena, and I'll let my children's teeth dull as a result. In other words, I can be happy and merry and do whatever I want. I'll let my children deal with the consequences. Now, as a good, moral, and upstanding person, no rational parent, no rational citizen would ever do things deliberately to harm their children or grandchildren. But this was the mentality that some people had. I'm not going to be alive to see them suffer, so I don't really care. Let them deal with it, not my problem. That's the nimshal, I guess, over here. The nimshal, the meaning of the parable behind what Yirmiyah is saying. Harambam, in his commentary to, in his Perush LaMishnayot, he gives a different interpretation, a different translation to this term. He says, Uferush keha, what does it mean? What does this term mean? It means mini'at ze hadat. This is in reference to a particular opinion that somebody had in this Mishnah. I'm not going to get into that right now. But basically, Harambam is saying it means to distance oneself from something. And the distancing of oneself from it. Right? This is exactly what the pasuk in Yirmiyah is referring to us when it says this. So why are unripe grapes referred to as causing haka'at shin'ayim? As why is it the language that the Navi uses with regard to unripe grapes in particular? So Harambam tells us, so as to, because unripe grapes are sour, and so when one puts an unripe grape, if it's really unripe and sour, when you put it in your mouth, your taste buds, your palate is going to tell you, stop chewing. This is not fit for consumption, spit it out. So I think for our purposes, with regard to what the Mechilta told us, Harambam's understanding of lehakot, not lehakot with a kaf, but with a kof, right, is a more appropriate understanding over here. Because what does it mean that the father has to dull out his child's teeth? It doesn't really make sense. Certainly, the popular way of translating it to knock out his teeth makes no sense. No grammarian agrees with that understanding of it, number one. And number two, I think to distance oneself, to have the son's rant distanced and separated from the dialogue is really what's most sensible over here. That's my humble opinion. I could be wrong. I don't know. I want to point out something regarding the Rasha, though, since we're focusing on the Rasha right now. There is a comment from Rabbeinu HaMeiri. The Meiri, in his commentary to Masechet Sanhedrin, talks about over here, what does it mean for a person to be Rasha? From the point of view of Jewish law, the term Rasha has a technical meaning too. When you have a wedding, when you have a divorce, when you have a contract that's signed, you need to have two witnesses. The Torah says, so you cannot have a Rasha serve as a witness legally on any of these documents. He cannot bear testimony legally in a court of law. So who is a Rasha? I need to know definitively who that person is. So the Gemara gives a number of examples, and one of those examples is basically anybody who violates Jewish law. It's a pretty broad criterion, but that's the halakha. And this is recorded as halakha in Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat, Siman Lamed Dalet. Rasha is anybody who violates the law. Now that would probably make all of us Rashaim. So, yeah, no one's perfect. The world must move on. We still have to get married. We still have to get divorced, God forbid. It's a part of life when that occurs. But what does it mean then to be a Rasha? So the Meiri, I think he says this beautifully. He says, Dvarim elu shenifselu ha'edim alehem. These things which witnesses are considered invalid for being a Rasha, dafka beshehem dvarim sha'dvarim mochichim alehem she'aoseh otam makir b'yisuran. This is in reference to only whenever a person violates the law. He, drives on Shabbat, he eats a cheeseburger, he beats his fellow Jew, he steals, whereby he does these actions knowing very well that they're wrong, and that knowing that they're wrong and doing so deliberately, he still commits them and transgresses them. So, umezid alehem, and he does so wantonly. But where an individual is doing something, he's in violation of halakha, but he's doing so either by means of indirect transgression. So he may not know that something is asur. He's ignorant of the fact that this is a prohibited activity in the Torah. Or he may not know he might not even know what he is doing. He may be doing something where he might not even be aware of the action that's being committed. Like, for example, somebody says something to an individual, and he doesn't believe that's meant to be offensive. It's not ona'at devarim in his mind. He thinks he's giving the guy a compliment, but the guy is offended by what he said. Or as I said, he may not know that this activity is asur. Lo nifselu ad sheyodi'um. Only once a person knows and is well informed, shu asur, right? And only then would it be considered a violation strong enough, or serious enough, I should say, to have a person as de facto Rasha until he does teshuvah for that. Meiri goes on to give some examples of things where people are not too well versed and they may violate them without knowing, like kosher on Shabbat. How many people are experts in the laws of tying knots on Shabbat and which knot is allowed, which knot is prohibited? What are the particularities of ochel nefesh on Yom Tov? How you properly light a barbecue? How can you properly extinguish a fire on Yom Tov, etc., etc. So very important point to keep in mind when we talk about who's Rasha. If you're going out of your way to belittle the Torah and to transgress the mitzvot of the Torah because you simply don't care and you have this burning hatred for the mitzvot, so the description that our Chachamim gave of the Rasha kind of makes sense, doesn't it? All right, we're not talking about some guy who's quote unquote off the derech because he's gone through some serious trauma, God forbid, or because there are personal difficulties or mental illness or things along those lines. Those factors are obviously not what our Chachamim are referring to over here. And so accordingly, our Chachamim would not instruct a father or a teacher to deal with a child in the way that he would with standard Rasha. Rabbi Elazar of Mainz, of Worms, in his Sefer HaRokeach. Sefer HaRokeach is one of the earliest works of halakha to emerge from Ashkenaz. So it's very valuable in that sense, in the sense that there are a lot of early insights, early chidushim in here that are worth exploring and sharing. So he says something that I think we should all be aware of. He says, if a person eats matzah on Pesach and he's so full to the point where it's considered achila gasa, kind of difficult to translate to set a rubric for that in halakha, but it's generally in reference to eating that is on the level of being nauseating, right? You're eating ad nauseum. About him, the Navi Hosea, he says, those who are posheya, they're transgressors of the Torah, they will stumble in performing the mitzvot. So why is that such a bad thing? Number one, because according to halakha, such a consumption is not a valid consumption. Even on Kippur, can you imagine? If you're stuffed to capacity ad nauseum a second before Kippur, and then Kippur begins a second later, it's like a second after Shekiah, and you say, to heck with all of it, I'm going to have myself a nice glass of Coke or another bite. It's asur, but you're not liable to karet for such a consumption because it's considered achila gasa. It's not real eating. So a person should not do that. If you truly are going to vomit and you consume the masa, particularly, I guess, the afikoman, right? On such a full stomach, lo yasa, you don't fulfill the mitzvah by doing so. And the Rokeach quotes this passage from the Yerushalmi regarding the Rasha. Kayosebo lo yomar kama Torah haPesach. Person should never place himself in a situation where he says, how burdensome is Pesach that I have to do this and I feel so terrible. By Yerushalmi, he quotes the Yerushalmi, Rasha mahu omer, maha avodah azot, maha Torah hazeh, right? Like we read earlier. Rabbi Yeshaya Ditrani, I'm going to read some of these sources outside as I see fit. He tells us, he gives us a different understanding of what does it mean to be a Rasha. Shaul HaMelech, during the course of his many victories as Melech, king and commander-in-chief of the Jewish people, is described in the book of Shemuel as being so victorious that Uvchol Asher Yifneh Yarshia. Rabbi Yeshaya Ditrani says, everywhere, the Navi says, anywhere where he turned, he was Marshia. What does it mean to be Marshia? He says, Mitkaber v'nosecham. He would overpower and overcome the enemy in victory. Just like a Rasha overcomes his fellow and robs him by overpowering him and overcoming him. Do you see from here also another trait of the Rasha? The Rasha a person may have beliefs that they keep to themselves, but they're respectful. There's decorum. There's etiquette at the table when you are not the Baal Habayit. If you're a guest, whether it's in your own home, meaning by your father's table, your parents' table, or certainly by someone else, where you're a complete stranger, you show derech eres. And if you don't, you're imposing your views on them now, aren't you? Where it's not asked for and where it's not warranted. Uvchol asher yifnei yarshia. We have Harambam in Hilchot Teshuvah, this is a famous passage from the Mishnah Torah where Harambam talks about those who have no portion in the world to come. And among those people, you have those who are Poresh Midarkei HaSibur, also very often misunderstood, but Harambam defines that as somebody who separates himself from the Jewish people in all aspects, even if he observes the mitzvot, but if he is hosi et asmo min hakelal, like the Mechilta told us, even if he observes these commandments, but he does so at the expense of excluding himself from the Jewish people for whatever reason, then he would be included in this category as well. Harambam reiterates this idea in Hilchot Evel when he talks about who one is permitted, or I should say, who one is obligated to mourn for under the laws of mourning in Jewish law. And those who we do not mourn for include anybody who is Poresh Midarkei HaSibur, somebody who hates the Jewish people with such passion and zeal that he may be observant, but he doesn't go to knis, doesn't go to synagogue, he doesn't contribute to tzedakah, he doesn't fast when they fast, he doesn't involve himself in their semachot or in their tragedies, God forbid, and he performs all the mitzvot in solitude. Right, so this is also, this idea is also alluded to in the pasuk itself, when the Torah tells us that the child asks, "Ma ha'avodah hazot v'amata elav," as we read. It's then that the father responds to him. Ibn Kaspi, in his Perush of the Torah, defines for us what it means, ha'avodah hazot. He says, "Hit asifam b'shchitat ha'pesach." They're gathering as a family when they offer the Korban HaPesach, when they slaughter it and eat it, the yeter uvyeter tena'av, as well as the other details that involve Korban Pesach that will be on the scope of this discussion, as well as the peculiarities that occurred during the first offering of the Pesach, by the smearing of the blood on the doorposts, etc., etc. You also have over here, Mesuda David defines for us what is the root of tipesh. So David HaMelech, in the famously long perek of Tehillim Kof Yotet, he says, "Tafash kachelev libam, ani toratecha shi'ashati." He says, "Tafash inyan shuman." This is in reference to something that is solid and congealed, like Navi Yeshaya says, "Ki hashmen lev ha'am hazeh," in reference to the Jewish people who have a solid heart, so to speak, a heart that doesn't melt. So that sort of informs us with regard to the level that the tam or the tipesh is holding in. He's not an individual, he's not a child who is stupid, as we said, but he's one who is either, according to one interpretation, of a difficulty, one who is struggling and has difficulty grasping context or content, I should say, or one who is simply uninformed. And it's the job of the father or the teacher to melt that solid intellect by teaching him, by beginning somewhere. He has the capability, it's just a matter of teaching and informing finally. I'm going to skip a little and I'm going to just go down to since we're on the topic of tam, I also have over here Rashi in his commentary to Bereshit Chafhe. He says, commenting on the pasuk that says Ve'Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim. Right? He says, who is a tam? Eno vaki b'chol ele. He's not so well versed in sayd, in hunting and trapping, in works of the field. He's not somebody who is mi she'eno charif leramot karui tam. Somebody who's not involved in deception and trickery. He's not savvy, I guess you could say. Instead, he is kelibo ken piv. What you hear and what you see is what you get. That's what's on the inside. We have a great word for this in Farsi, for those who know Farsi. We call such a person sadeh. A person who is sadeh is he's very wholesome. He's very transparent. Toho kevaro, and he's of pure intent. There's no ulterior motive going on over here. So, such an individual, such a child, has the full potential and ability to learn. He's just lacking the content. So there, again, you go back to that dynamic, that disagreement, I should say, between the Yerushalmi and the Mechilta. Do you begin with halachot, or do you begin by building the inspirational foundation of Bechozek Yad Hosianu Adonai Mitzrayim? I'll end off with a passage from Rav Saadia Gaon's Sidur. This is from the Blau edition, and I'm using the Hebrew translation of Professor Yoshua Blau, alav shalom. And he says over here on page 137, we fill the second cup upon the recitation of Magid. V'im yesh sham yeled bar da'at, you have a capable, intellectually capable child, Yamod al raglav, stands up, ve'yishal, ma davar halayla hazeh, ma nishtana halayla hazeh, as we would say, kefi sha'avar, like Saadia Gaon is going to elaborate upon in his commentary to the Haggadah. Ve'achacham shebachabura, and it's the chacham that responds to the child. Meshiv lo teshuvah she'er shomota. I'm going to write what the chacham should respond, and Saadia Gaon does that later on. V'im en sham yeled bar da'at, if there is no intellectually capable child present, harei chacham hazeh hu ashoel vehu ameshiv. Very powerful lesson. Being a chacham is not just about teaching and sharing the Torah that you know. Sometimes you have to ask yourself the obvious questions. Saadia Gaon gets this idea from a Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara in Pesachim says famously, if there is nobody to ask, then you have to be shoel et atzmo. The person has to ask himself these questions. Sometimes asking yourself the most obvious of questions can be the best tool of teaching. You'll be surprised what insights a person can learn by reviewing the basics. So I want to end off here. There was more than I had prepared, but I also want to leave time for questions. So if there are any questions, I am delighted to take them.
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute or to write in the chat. We have Vitat. Would it be possible to share the source sheet?
Would it be possible to share the source sheet? Absolutely. I could share the source sheet with anybody who wants it. I'm happy to share privately unless there is a way to do so here.
I have one question, which is, a little bit more broader about the Haggadah itself. The Haggadah, sorry for not formulating it properly, but the Haggadah seems like this. We study the text and it's like this outline, but then we use that as the actual event itself, which is sort of strange. Like, we don't say, okay, it gives us an outline. Let's study the outline. Let's study the instructions. And then let's have this organic meal event with our kids. It's like that now becomes the actual ritual or the structure. So how do we balance that, or is that what was intended?
It seems very clearly from all the sources that we studied that that's not what was intended. It's not supposed to be a formulaic or a ritualistic recitation. It's not a tefillah. It's not like you have to recite from a formal text. Are you Yosef the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim by reading the text? I think so, but that misses the whole point. And that goes back to your first point, which is balancing the two. I think it's worthwhile for all of us in our own families to introduce Magid in a new light by using the text not as a formula, but as, I guess you could say, a syllabus of sorts to engage in a family discussion that makes the seder not only informative, not only educational, but meaningful to all those that are present. And it's really important that I repeat this. This has ramifications in halakha, because when we're reading the text alone as a formula, like you would from a sidur, one can possibly not fulfill this very important mitzvah min Torah, where such as a case where you have family members or guests who don't know Hebrew. If they don't have the linguistic tools to be able to understand what is said, I mean that's a serious problem. So obviously, if you're a guest somewhere, let's not be a rasha, right? We're not going to, God forbid, impose and change people's family practices and customs. But in our own homes, Ohad, I think that's a good initiative to take.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that this is very informative, Hacham.
Thank you.
And even just to touch upon Ohad's question, I think we even see that formulation come about in Saadia Gaon's Haggadah, Sidur, that it's he even sort of like highlights what is to be said and what can be discussed. And I think also through Harambam also, it's more about the asiyah, the actual telling of the story. And then there's a framework for those who, maybe for the tam that is in all of us to sort of follow. But it was very, very informative. I really want to thank you for that. It was very, very informative.
My pleasure. And one of the reasons why I pointed out this passage from Seder Saadia Gaon is actually because his take on Magid is actually different than anything that we discussed. You'll notice it's not the father over here that stands up and teaches, it's the Chacham. And it's not necessarily the biological child who's present at the Seder who asks the questions, it's a Yeled Bardat. So again, this kind of goes back to Ohad's point as well. The instructions are not meant to be formulaic. They're meant to be a rubric for which somebody who knows what they are talking about is able to have an informative discussion with those who know not as much. And a dialogue begins at the table based on that initial exchange. So Saadia Gaon actually, it's very, very succinct and brief, but it's brilliant what he says. It takes the principle of the reality that existed during the days of the Tanaim and the Amoraim, and he brings it down to the reality that existed in his days, which I think is it's good advice for all of us.
I think even in the Rambam's version of the Haggadah, right? There's like some essential parts you need to say, and other stuff that is actually meant for you to sort of, like you said, it should be organic. It should be very, very organic, and definitely the focal point are the children.
100%.
Exactly.
All right. Avi, are you,
yeah, it could be you covered it, but I'm just trying, maybe you could summarize it quickly. So the Rasha, let's consider him some practically speaking, at a table, if someone is a rebel but sort of turns up, right? You mentioned the idea of distance his rant, but how does that exactly look like? Is that basically you're silencing him? Is he's saying he's not welcome? What does that look like when you have someone who just disagrees with what you're doing over Pesach and is just cynical? And how would you actually do that in real life, I think?
So in real life, because this is supposed to be practical, right? You pointed out something that's really important to note, and I'm really happy you brought it up. The Rasha is a part of the dialogue here. He's still one of the Arba Banim. He showed up. Lehavdil. In my capacity as a chaplain in the U.S. Air Force, one of the trainings that we receive regarding suicide prevention is the fact that if somebody is contacting you for concern or because they're, God forbid, going to commit suicide, you already know that they're looking for a way out because they're calling you. The Rashas, again, I may offend some people who have different beliefs than I, people who are atheists or agnostic, but this is what I believe. If somebody is showing up to the Seder and they're making these comments, it's to a degree, I think, a subconscious cry. Maybe not for Torah, or maybe not for learning the particularities of Hilchot HaPesach, but it's a cry to be included. That's, I think, the first step in what we saw from Harambam and two other sources to bringing this person back into the fold. You bring him back to the fold of Torah by simply physically bringing him back, because the Rashan is he who excludes himself not only spiritually but physically from the people. If he's showing up, that's the first step in, I guess, for lack of better terms, recovery. What we don't tolerate, though, is disrespect. So he shows up, he makes the comments, Af ata haked shinav. We distance the rhetoric that he is presenting because it's not part of the protocol and etiquette of the Seder table. You can begin, again, lefi da'at ben ha'av melamedo. You, as a competent father or teacher, have to know how to gauge such an individual subjectively. There's no one size fits all, but it deserves a response. The inquiry, as disrespectful as it may be, deserves a response. Not a response to the disrespect, but a response in engaging in a different form of dialogue. Hope that makes sense. Yeah.
What is the va'af over there?
What was that?
What is the va'af? Meaning va'af atah haked shinav.
That's a good point. So that's a very, very good point. Af means that you're doing that which the Rasha is doing to you. Even you do the same thing back to him, right? So it's a good implication. It's a good diuk, actually, in the Mechilta that I didn't pick up on. I'm happy you picked up on that, which is that the Rasha, according to the Mechilta, is trying to distance our rhetoric from being taught. He's trying to prevent the discussion of Pesach from occurring at the table by saying these things. So in response, we stop him from pushing his rhetoric. It's midah keneged midah, in other words. That's a very, very good point. I didn't pick up on that. Thank you for pointing that out. Because that language doesn't exist by the other children. It only exists by the Rasha. The Yerushalmi uses the same language, by the way. Afata imorlo.
I once heard from Hacham ben Haim. He was Hacham ben Haim. No, sorry, Hacham Haim Ovadia. He once said something very interesting about the whole Vein Maftirin. What are the words? Vein Maftirin Harafikoman. I'm sorry if I'm not clear on those words. But he said the original meeting was, you have your dessert and you don't leave, right? Like that was the original intent, like you said, right? Like you stay and you're with your family, even if you might disagree. That's the whole point, is that we have, I guess, we sort of deal with our differences, and that's the real hashivut of not eating after the afikoman. Is the whole idea is that we're staying together. We're not going to see our friends. We're not going to see people. And I think you said that in your point. And I just thought how important it is, because talking about, you give them the same, the va'af, you give them the same degree of alienation, but not to the point, you don't surpass it. You still want them to be included, and you want to make sure that no one leaves. So that was, that just resonated with me. So thanks for that.
Beautiful. There are a number of Rishonim who also bring that down. That's true. Beautiful. Any other questions?
Okay. Alishava.
Sorry, I want to be seen. I think you may have covered it. I just wonder, as an educator, as a parent, if very often the responsible are us, the parents, the teachers, who haven't been able to educate and motivate and go deep into the story, I mean, in general, that this, what we call the Reshaim, are probably a victim of maybe the circumstances, the society, those of us who have not been able to teach them well, inspire them, who have left them down. Is my question.
I'm not sure if I understood the question. I'm sorry.
Sorry, that to what point are maybe when we consider them Reshaim, maybe they are victims of us not being responsible parents and educators?
So that's a very good question, and I did briefly address it. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, one of the great Rishonim originally from Spain, actually, but later in his life, most of his life in Provence, he pointed out that the Rasha is somebody who deliberately and brazenly violates the Torah and its commandments, knowing very well that what he is doing is wrong, knowing better, not just superficially, but he knows the halachot, he knows the intricacies, and he disregards it regardless, just out of pure spite. So such a person would fall into the category from the point of view of halakha as being a rasha. We're not talking about, for example, in the community that I grew up, in the Iranian Jewish community, you'll have many people, for example, who drive to synagogue on Shabbat, but you better bet very well they know tefillah inside and out. They know Te'ameh Mikra better than most people in Lakewood. They show up to every shiur that they can, and kashrut in the home, believe me, they know what they're doing.
Right.
But let's say they're not particular about certain things, because culturally,
I was just more referring to kids of the derech.
So I think the same holds true for many who are quote unquote off the derech. But again, it's difficult to generalize when we're talking about such a subjective problem, because each child, each individual who is self-proclaimed off the derech or acts that way has their own subjective reasons for that. So if it's due to a trauma, for example, that's a completely different discussion. We're not talking about a rasha there. We're talking about somebody who's suffering from something that needs to be dealt with.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe to jump on Elisheva's point, I was just wondering, is it tinok shenishbat? I happen to work in a community where a lot of people just have a very different view on halakha. And so part of what I'm trying to do is sort of like educate as much as I can, but so these people come with preconceived notions. And so not the Reshaim, they actually, believe more natural law, let's say, than Torah or something like that. So would they be considered like if you had to put them in a box? Obviously, these four children, it's not a perfect circle or perfect box, but these people have adamant resentment because maybe of the lack of education at home, which is what I'm seeing. Would they be considered the tipesh? Would they be considered the tam? They're definitely not the reshaim because they don't know, right? It's not and so I think maybe that's more the question. They're probably the tam. I don't know.
They would most closely resemble the tam,
right?
Because if they really did know better and they really were super talmidei chachamim and they went off the deep end and started rebelling just out of spite, then they would be the rasha. But what you're describing regarding tinokot shenishbu it's been a hotly debated topic in halakha for a number of centuries now. It's generally assumed nowadays, like the famous ruling of Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger in his Binyan Sion, and many Achronim adopt this view, that nowadays in the 20th and 21st centuries, when we have people who are not practicing mitzvot out of spite, but they simply, they don't know better. They may see others acting quote unquote religiously, but that doesn't necessarily count as informing an individual. It doesn't sink in to the same degree. And so certainly such an individual is not a rasha. When you speak to such people, when you talk to such people and you get to know them, it's obvious instantly that we're not talking about somebody who fits that criteria. By the same token, the general practice nowadays is that such an individual is also not used as a witness for gitin, for marriage, etc., just out of the sensitivity of the legalities regarding wanting to satisfy all opinions for legal documents and the like. But we certainly count such people for minyan. We certainly call these people up to the Torah. If they are kohanim, we certainly call them to do birkat kohanim for us. It's a pretty universally accepted now. I know there's some circles that don't accept that, but I think that's without solid halachic basis, in my opinion.
What scares that through your interpretation of a rasha, you can even have a Talmid Chacham, whatever that may be a rasha. If they impose their view, or they're at a table and they're dissatisfied with how things are going on, then they're not including themselves within that family or within that household. That's a fine line it's more of a fine line between a Chacham and a rasha than a Tam and a rasha.
You're absolutely right about that. It's a very good point. Very good point. Being a Chacham is not just about knowledge, but also about etiquette. Yep.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think that is it for tonight. Thank you so much, Chacham. It was very insightful. It's always a privilege and pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And stay tuned for all the other awesome shurim, and for hopefully another one of the shurim from the Chacham.
Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.